Okay, all set? Okay, hey everyone. Today I'm going to be learning from a new book based on the Rebbe Seichas. It's called Light Points. Just came out. Light Points. You should really get it. It's a terrific book. It's based on Parsha of the Week, and it's based on the Seichas of the Rebbe on the Parshas. So this particular section is from Likutei Seichas, the Rebbe's talks, volume 25. We know that there's probably quite about maybe 35 volumes of Likutei Seichas altogether that have been printed. So I'm going to be talking about different Seichas from the Rebbe based on the Parsha. The Parsha, of course, is Lech Lecha, which is the beginning of the story of Abraham. And it talks about how, the beginning talks about how Abraham is told, Lech Lecha mi'artzecha mi'moladtecha mi'beis avicha el ha'aretz asher areka. God tells Abraham, go from your land, from your birthplace, from your father's house, to the land which I will show you. And the story of Abraham, the Rebbe points out, starts when he was, I think, about 70 years old. What happened to Abraham all those years beforehand? How did Abraham come to believe in God? What is the story of Abraham being thrown into the fiery furnace with Nimrod, on Nimrod's orders? Where are all these things mentioned? Nowhere in the Torah are they mentioned. We find them in Midrashim, in external stories from Torah Shabbal Peh, from the oral tradition, but we do not find really much at all, anything in fact, of Abraham's early years before he started his journey and before he started his mission in life, his great mission in life, to bring the world to monotheism. So why is that? What is the significance of that? So the Rebbe points out, he says that we don't even have a brief description of Abraham, but with Noach we did. If you recall, with Noach, it starts right off the parsha at the beginning. He was a righteous man. He was a righteous man. And so from Noach's very beginnings, there was a righteousness. We don't find that with Abraham. It doesn't say anywhere that Abraham was a righteous man at all. Where do we know that Abraham came to the belief in God and how he came to that belief in God? Actually, it doesn't mention it anywhere. Instead, the Torah introduces Abraham by telling him to leave his home, etc., and to go to the land which he will show you. And why is that? So the Torah defines the unique nature of Abraham's relationship with God, distinguishing him and the Jewish people from the rest of civilization. What was so significant about it? So the Rebbe is going to point out that it was not so important, Abraham coming to God, Abraham discovering God, recognizing the oneness of God. What was significant is God recognizing Abraham, God choosing the Jewish people. The fact that Abraham came to God was very nice and very important. But the important thing was God coming to us, God coming to the Jews and choosing the Jews as his partner in bringing the world closer to godliness. The Rebbe says all of humankind is capable of discovering God and committing to him. We find Jewish people aren't the only people who are monotheists. Jewish people aren't the only ones who believe in God, who have come to God. Lots of people have in the world. What makes us unique, however, is that our primary relationship with God lies not in our recognizing God and our decision to attach ourselves to him, but in God's choice of us as his people. That is what makes it significant. And in fact, that is the theme of the entire Torah, if you think about it. Not so much our choosing, but God choosing us. That is really the important thing. And that is the unique thing. Likewise, the primary significance of the mitzvahs that God gave the Jewish people lies not in their impact on the individual or the world, but in God's desire that we fulfill these observances and adhere to his will. God tells us, put on tefillin. What is the significance of tefillin? Well, tefillin brings the connection between one's heart, one's emotions, one's intellect, one's actions together. Nice, very nice. But is that why we put on tefillin? Do we put on tefillin because of that? Because it is meaningful to us? It is significant to us? Or do we put on tefillin because God told us to put on tefillin? God told us to wear tzitzis. God told us to keep Shabbos and keep kosher. Even if these things had no significance at all to us, no meaning to us at all, we would still do them. In fact, some of the mitzvahs are called chukim, which means they have no reason at all. They have no reason given by the Torah at all. They're simply a chok. God told us, do it, we do it. If God told us to stand on our head for 1 hour each day, we would stand on our head for 1 hour each day. The importance of the mitzvah is not so much the significance of the mitzvah to us, but the significance of the mitzvah to God. God is the one who is giving it to us, and God wants us to do it. So that's really the important thing here. There are many Jews in the world who believe that I will do things if they're meaningful to me. If they're not meaningful to me, I won't do them. Because after all, what is it all about? It's about me. It's not about God, it's about me. So the fact is that if something is not meaning for me, I don't care for something doesn't make sense to me, I won't do it. Is that really what Judaism is really all about? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Judaism is about doing what God wants us to do. In many respects, it's similar to the relationship we have with our spouse. Our wife tells us, please take out the garbage. I'll say, well, I don't see that the garbage is very full. Maybe there's more room over there. Maybe I don't have to take it out yet. It doesn't make sense to me to take out the garbage just yet. She says, I don't care. I want you to take it out. It's important for me that you take it out. And if something is important to her, I'll do it, even if it doesn't make any sense to me at all. Because the important thing in any relationship is not what you're getting out of it, but more so what you're giving into it. That's the important thing. A relationship really means giving more than taking. And so it is. God says to us, you find it meaningful? That's nice. But even if you don't find it meaningful, do it anyways. There are certain things in Judaism that I frankly do not understand and don't make any sense to me at all, such as illegitimacy of children, mamzeris. How is it possible that a child could possibly have a stigma of being an illegitimate child? Granted that he's born from an illicit relationship, either adultery or incest, which is the requirement to be an illegitimate child, a mamzer, but it doesn't make sense to me. Why are we penalizing a beautiful little child that they can only marry another mamzer because of something that their parents did? Does that make sense to me? Does it make sense to you? It doesn't. But nevertheless, go ahead, I do it. I follow it. I observe that commandment. Why? Because God gave it to me. And if God gave it to me, I know that ultimately it's good for me. It's an important thing for me. As it happens, it has helped to keep married life strong. We do not have very many cases of illegitimacy in Jewish life. You don't find very many Jewish people who have done adultery or incest in Jewish life throughout the years. They're very rare. And perhaps that's why, because of the stigma attached to the child that would be created as a result of that horrible relationship. But nevertheless, that's not why I do it. I do it because God told me to do it. I don't understand why we have to have a mechitza in the synagogue, why we have to separate the men from the women during the synagogue services. Doesn't make sense to me. Today, in our modern day and age, men and women freely mix with each other, sit together with each other, and the separation really has never been something that meant anything to me. But nevertheless, I would never go to a synagogue that didn't have a mechitza. I would never pray in a synagogue that did not have the separation, even though I don't really see the purpose of it in my own life. But I do it because God told me to do it, because that's how it is. That's how Jews pray, with a mechitza, with a separation. That's how we do it. Many years ago, when I was a young kid in yeshiva, we were studying Jewish law. And I mentioned to the teacher, to the rabbi who was giving the class, I said to him, "Oh, that's ridiculous. That doesn't make sense at all." It was something to do with Shabbos observance that seemed quite contradictory. And he turned to me and he said to me, "Don't ever say it's ridiculous. Say you don't understand it. It's not ridiculous because it's in the Shulchan Aruch. It's in the Code of Jewish Law. It's something that God gave us. It's not ridiculous. It is part of Jewish tradition, Jewish heritage, and there's a reason for it. It could be that I understand the reason. Maybe I don't understand the reason. But nevertheless, where does it say that we only have to do things if we find a reason or meaning for something? That's not why we're doing mitzvahs. We're doing mitzvahs because we love God. We want to attach ourselves to God. And the way we attach ourselves to God is through the mitzvahs, through doing a mitzvah, through keeping Shabbos, keeping kosher, keeping the holidays, doing these things, putting on tzitzis. Even if we may not find these things particularly meaningful to us, nevertheless we do them. Many times we've done things that we didn't understand, and later on we found great meaning for them. For example, kosher. Kosher is a chok. It's a law without any meaning to it whatsoever. And Jewish people always kept kosher. That's the way we ate. And you had no idea why, because God told us that's why. People would come to us and say, "Does that make sense? You can't eat shellfish. You can't eat pork. Everybody eats pork. Why can't you eat pork?" The non-Jews used to say to us, "Eat it. There's nothing wrong with it. It's healthy for you. Everybody eats it. Why don't you eat it?" So we did notice that many people who ate these things got sick. But we thought, well, that's how it is. Everybody gets sick. Later on, it was only in the late 1800s, with the scientist Louis Pasteur, that we found that there was such a thing called bacteria. And we found that certain things, if you don't cook them well, they develop bacteria that can harm you, that can hurt you. And among these things are shellfish and non-kosher fish and non-kosher animals, that you can get trichinosis from these things. If you ask the Jew in the 1200s why he kept kosher, he'll tell you, because God told me. If you'll ask a Jew during the bubonic plague, why do you think the non-Jews are getting the plague and the Jews are not? Well, many Jews got it also. He would probably say, because we keep the Torah and mitzvahs and they don't. Because we follow God's law and they don't. If you'll ask a non-Jew during the bubonic plague, why do you think the Jews are not getting it? He would say, because the Jews are from the devil, and the devil is responsible for this plague. So the Jews are giving the plague to the non-Jews. Of course, we know that's ridiculous. We know that's not the reason. We know that the plague came about because of unsanitary conditions and because of a disease that swept over Europe, and there were medical reasons for it. And if we had antibiotics in those days, we probably would have not had such a disease like that. We find that Jewish people kept more kosher. They washed their hands before they ate. They were much more sanitary and were very much more concerned about hygiene than our non-Jewish neighbors were. And therefore, we were less likely to get the plague than they were. But in the bubonic plague of the Middle Ages, people didn't see it that way. It was a extra added benefit that God gave us for keeping kosher. And the same is true with so many of the mitzvahs. The Greeks and the Romans felt that the Jews would never amount to anything because they kept one day off. They didn't go to work on Shabbos. And they felt that we're not going to accomplish anything. Look at them. They accomplished tremendous things, the great Roman and Greek empires, the Persian empires. And the Jews never got to that level. Now we realize the importance of leisure and how important it is to have a day off. Not just 1 day, 2, 3 days off even. Today we talk about that what they call creative leisure is a very, very important aspect of modern life today that we understand much better. So the Rebbe points out that the significance, the primary significance of the mitzvahs that God gave the Jewish people lies not in their impact on the individual or the world, but in God's desire that we fulfill these commandments and adhere to his will. That's what God wants us for more than ever. The Torah therefore leaves out any background information about Avram's piety and the good deeds he did before God spoke to him. Indeed, he came to belief in God when he was only 3 years old. He came to it logically. He felt that if there's a creation, there must be a creator behind it. That's the whole idea of this. God gave us a world, and therefore there must have been someone who made that world like everything else in the world. So he came to it on his own at a very young age through logic. God spoke to him. Instead, the Torah begins with the first commandment, go forth from your land, to emphasize that man's finite efforts to develop a meaningful relationship with God are utterly insignificant in comparison to the connection that is forged by God singling out the Jew and commanding him and the Jew in turn observing God's commandments. When we choose to separate ourselves from God, separate ourselves from God's commandments, well, we're on our own. Good luck to you. And we know that whether it's in terms of health, whether it's in terms of the continuity of Judaism, it all is related. And the more we separate ourselves, the more we will be separate from God. There is a very interesting idea that I saw recently, that in the 1960s, the conservative movement in Jewish life decided that they were going to make driving to shul on Shabbos permissible. Until then, we knew you weren't allowed to drive on Shabbos, even to go to shul. But they were realizing that fewer of their people were coming to shul. So they were very concerned about that. So they decided to tell everybody, now it is permissible to drive to shul on Shabbos, but only if you are only going to shul, and only if you're not going to stop along the way, and these types of things. So they made it kosher to drive to shul on Shabbos. And everybody seemed to be happy with that situation. When the last chancellor of the conservative seminary retired, he spoke at his going away dinner. And he was talking about things that he had done and his movement had done over the years. And he said one of the big mistakes we made over the years was allowing people to drive to shul on Shabbos. Why? Because if they could drive to shul on Shabbos, they could live wherever they wanted to live. They didn't have to live near a synagogue. They didn't have to live near a Jewish community anymore. They could live way out in the suburbs where there was no Jewish life at all. And that became an extremely harmful thing. Because now they would send their children to public school, not to Jewish day schools or yeshivas. And in the public school, they would be the only Jewish kid in the whole school. And when it came time for them to date, who was there to date? There were no Jewish kids around to date, so they would date non-Jews. And they would marry them. And they would have non-Jewish children. And in other words, this led to the terrible destruction of Jewish life and Jewish community as a result of that. It had nothing to do with driving to shul or not driving to shul, but it caused Jewish communities to be destroyed. We know that if you cannot drive to shul on Shabbos, you have to live near a synagogue. And if you live near a synagogue, you have to be in a community. In the community, there's going to be Jewish schools, there's going to be kosher butcher shops, kosher markets, there's going to be all kinds of aspects of Jewish life. There's going to be learning going on, Torah learning going on. You'll be in close proximity to rabbis, on and on and on. Perhaps that is why we're not allowed to drive to shul on Shabbos. because God wanted us to be close to a synagogue and to be involved in Jewish life in a community, because community is one of the most important, if not the most important aspects of Jewish life. Is that why we don't drive to Shul on Shabbos? No. Why don't we drive to Shul on Shabbos? Because God doesn't want us to do that. God chose to do it, to tell us what to do, and we follow it for that reason. Again, the idea of God choosing us rather than us choosing God. Lots of people choose God. Monotheism is not the realm of the Jewish people alone, but God choosing us, that is the realm of the Jewish people alone. Here's another sikha taken from this was said in 1990. In 1990. Again, it's on the verse, God said to Abraham, go forth from your land, from your birthplace, from your father's house, to the land that I will show you. So he says that Lech Lecha begins, place that Abraham will be leaving superfluous. Obviously, it says go from your land. Obviously, if you're going from your land, you're going from your birthplace, from your father's house, and so obviously that's the case. Why does it have to say also from your birthplace, also from your father's house? And so the Rebbe points out, a journey to any new land automatically requires leaving your current location, and obviously your home and place of birth. Why mention them? Why do they have to be mentioned? Moreover, some details about where he would be relocating would be helpful. It certainly would be better to know where we're going. If you know where you're going, you'll prepare for it appropriately. If you're going to a cold climate, I'll need to wear a sweater. If it's going to be wet, I need to put on boots. So it's important to know where I'm going. Why didn't God mention to them, tell them where they were going? Where they're going. That Abraham was told only that his point of departure, but not told anywhere about his destination. I heard an interesting thing that Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, we should all pray for him. He has Yenamachli, he's ill. We should pray for his refuah shlema. Rabbi Sachs points out an interesting thing about destination. He says that you can learn an important lesson from everything in this world, including a GPS. A GPS tells you where to go. So the GPS, you have a destination in mind, you punch it into the GPS, and the GPS says, okay, start along this route, you go here, you go there, you go here, you go there. Well, Jewish people don't like to be told where to go. Jewish people say, you think you know where to go? I know better where to go. So the GPS tells you to go on this particular route. It's happened to me many times that it told me to go on a particular route. And I said, no, that's not the route. I know the route. That's not it. And indeed, the GPS was right all along, of course. It's always like that. So Rabbi Sachs says he was listening to his GPS, and he was thinking, what happens if you decide to go a different route on the GPS? The GPS tells you to go one way, you decide you're going to go on another way. Does the GPS get angry at you? Does the GPS yell at you? No. The GPS simply says we're relocating, we are redefining the route. We're going to take you a different direction. And the GPS never gets angry at us. The GPS always tells us how to get to our destination, and eventually we get to our destination. Whether we are getting there or the GPS is going to tell us how to get there, even if we don't know how to get there or we are going in a wrong direction, it'll always get us to our GPS. So he says we learned from that an important lesson. As long as you know your destination, you'll end up getting to the right place. The main thing is you need to know the destination. You need to know what the ultimate goal is. And if you know the goal, you'll get there eventually. With this command, however, God mapped out the steps a Jew must take to reach his ultimate destination in his divine service. It's a journey of many steps, requiring that one transcend all his personal constraints and motives in order to make the fulfillment of God's will the defining feature of his life. The same thing is true years later, when the Jewish people left Egypt, they went on 42 different journeys that are recounted in the Torah, El Masa, the generations. These are the trips of the Jewish people as they, when they left Egypt. And these various trips that they took throughout a 40-year period represented various stages in their development and in their lives. So each one, and we are told that in our lives, we Jews also have these many steps that we go through in our life as well. Marriage, children, education, moving from one area to the other area, etc., etc. We all go through different stages in our life. And similarly, it was with Abraham years earlier, that Abraham also went through stages in his life to get him to where he had to go. First he came to Israel, which was Canaan at that time, and then he ended up to go to Egypt, and then he came back, and on and on. So it's interesting that years later, with Moshe, Jewish people also went through similar stages. And therefore we have the expression that is Ma'aseh Avos Siman Lebanim, the story of our forefathers is a sign unto the children. That just as our forefathers went through various stages in their lives, took various trips in their lives, so it is that we do that as well. So the Rebbe says it's a journey of many steps, requiring that one transcend all his personal constraints and motives in order to make the fulfillment of God's will the defining feature of his life as well. These steps are hinted at in God's command to Avram. As it says, go forth from your land. What does it mean from your land? Land represents nature. The first command means abandon your natural preferences. Where you're going to go is going to be quite different than what you're used to and what you are accustomed to. Abandon that. Abandon the way you look at life, at the way you usually see things. God is going to take us in a different direction. Your birthplace means your environment, and it shapes your habits and your lifestyle. Your birthplace is where you were born, you were raised. I was raised this way. I'm not familiar with this. You know, we had a fellow in our synagogue who came to shul every day. He kept Shabbos every day. But one thing he would not do, he would not buy a lulav and esrog for Sukkot. And I said to him one time, why don't you do that? Why you do everything else? Why don't you buy? You know, you're a comfortable man. You can well afford $50 for a lulav and esrog. Why aren't you getting it? And you know what he answered me? Because my father didn't get one. My father didn't get one, I don't need to get one. So we need to abandon that idea. Even though our father, our parents, our environment, the place where we grew up, didn't do some things or did certain things, doesn't mean we should have to follow that as well. We don't have to follow the trends and the influences of our surroundings always. Finally, from your father's house, this alludes to our education provided by the parents who raised you. Could be that our parents did a good job in many respects. They took care of us, they provided shelter for us and food for us and good values for us. But it could be that many other things they didn't provide for us. Maybe they didn't raise us so observant in Jewish life. Maybe they didn't tell us the importance of mitzvahs in our life, perhaps so much. So this command tells us that in order to reach the promised land, so to speak, our devotion to God must supersede our academic sophistication and intellectual achievements. Just because we went to college and we were taught certain things by our professors in college doesn't mean that that is the law of Moses from Mount Sinai, that that is the way it has to be. We need to come to God on our own, and we need to follow the Torah on our own, regardless of if it's our father's house, what we're used to, or not. He says, finally, to the land that I will show you, to a person who devotes himself unconditionally to God, surrendering any personal preferences, calculations, or biases, the specific destination is really irrelevant. It really ultimately does not matter where we're going. but rather our readiness to fulfill whatever God wills us is always the same, regardless of the particulars, regardless of where we're living or what we're going to be, it's going to be our environment in that place that we're going. And a good example of that is the Chabad rabbis who go from their hometown in Brooklyn, New York, where their parents live, and their yeshiva, and their community, and all their friends, and they go to a community that is completely foreign to them, that does not share the values in which they grew up at all in any which way. And the Rebbe told us, go to that place. Go there. And in that place you will find your purpose in life. You will find your destination, where you're supposed to be. And it will be in that place that you will find your purpose. And indeed, so many of us have. We take our hats off to the shluchim all over the world, especially those who have gone to far away places that in many cases don't provide even the most basic Jewish or any other services for that matter to us. I remember reading about the shluchim in Moldova, in Russia, Moldova, I don't know if it's in Russia or Ukraine, one of these places. And when it came time for them to have a baby, there was no hospital that was good enough for them. That the hospital there, I guess they had a particular situation where they needed more exacting care, more specific care. So they were from Israel originally, and they ended up going back to Israel to have their children, because it was not possible to have these children in the city in which they lived. And after they had a child, they went right back to their shlichus, right back to their community to help with the people in their community. And so many of the shluchim from all over the world are like that. They have gone to a place that God has chosen for them. The Rebbe picked them up and told them to go. There are many stories about young shluchim, newly married, who were called into the Rebbe's office, and they were told, the Rebbe said to them, are you interested in going away to a community to build Yiddishkeit in a community? And they said yes. And the Rebbe said to them, aren't you interested in where you're going? Don't you want to know where you're going? If it's a warm climate, a cold climate, if there's Jews there, what's there? And they said, no. If you're telling us we should go someplace, we're going, no matter where it is. So if you're lucky, you get to go to San Diego, where it's nice and warm. And there's lots of Jews over here. And there's schools and kosher markets and all kinds of stuff. If you're not so lucky, you get to go to places that are far away places where there's no Jewish life at all, except for travelers that come over from time to time. I once went to Cancun, and the shluchim there have been there for many years in Cancun, but every summer there's no shluchim, there's no tourists there because it's too hot. So there's really nothing for them to do. So the summertime they go back to New York for a few weeks. But after the summer, they're right back into their shlichus in Cancun, where they're feeding literally hundreds of people that come every single Shabbos. And we were there, and we were so inspired by the work that they are doing. What do they do with their children? They have an online school that their children are on. The children do not go to school. They're on online school. And they get an education through that way. The kids don't go to yeshivas. The kids don't have any other religious Jewish friends. But that's their shlichus. That's where they live. That's where their destiny has taken them. And we find that not just in terms of shlichus, we find that in lots of examples. People wonder, what in the world am I doing here? Why aren't I back where my parents live, or in Borough Park, or in a religious Jewish community where there's so many things there for me? What am I doing in the middle of Nebraska, in this place, or whatever it may be? And the answer is, only God knows. God puts you in that place for a particular reason. And that particular reason will usually come to you over a period of time. Might be sooner than later, hopefully. But we are all put in a destination, in a place, for a reason. God has put all of us, every single one of us, in that place for a reason. I know many people who have come to San Diego from New York, for example. And they came here because they had a job here. or they came because of the weather. But then they're starting to think, what am I doing here? My parents don't live here. I have no family here. I have very little Jewish life here, as like I had in New York. What in the world am I doing here? So it comes out that they need to send their child to a Hebrew school. So Chabad has a Hebrew school. So they bring their child to the Hebrew school at Chabad, and there they start getting involved and start becoming observant, getting involved in Judaism. If they would never have come here, that never would have happened. Years ago, I remember meeting a young man who was a medical student when there was a medical school once in Ensenada, Mexico, across the border. And every Shabbos, him and a bunch of his friends would spend Shabbos with us at the Chabad house. And he was here in San Diego. And he said, when I was growing up, I grew up in Borough Park. Borough Park is a very Orthodox community in New York. But I wasn't at all religious over there. But I come to San Diego, and in San Diego, I end up becoming observant. He never would have been observant in Borough Park, but in San Diego, he became observant. Here's another sikha. This sikha was from Rishimas, from the book of Rishimos, various notes that the Rebbe had put together that were not part of a formal sikha. And the Torah says, V'yavo afalit v'yagen v'al Avram ha'ivri. A palit, what is a palit? A palit is translated as a fugitive. So a fugitive came to Avram's home and told him that his nephew Lot, his brother's son, was taken as a captive of war, as a prisoner of war. The Midrash explains what happened. Who was this fugitive? Og. Og is a very interesting figure. He was a giant who lived during that time. We're told that Og was one of the few who survived the flood by holding on to the ark during the flood. He was very, very powerful, very strong, and he lived many, many years. So this guy, Og, was the fugitive who came to Avram to tell him that Lot had been taken a prisoner of war. Why did he tell Avram that? Why is he called Og? Because when he came, he found Avram busy with the mitzvah of ugos. Ugos means cakes in Hebrew. And the Torah, when the Torah refers to ugos, it usually means matzah. For ugos, from Og. Og, ugos. So he was making matzah. He was preparing matzah. We know from this that Avram, as all of the patriarchs and Noach, kept the Torah before it was given. So he was keeping Pesach. According to the Midrash, Avram was preparing matzah when Og arrived. The Midrash continues. Og's intentions were not for the sake of heaven. Why did he tell this to Avram? He thought, this Avraham is a real fanatic, a real zealot. I see how he's keeping matzahs, he's doing these things. I'll tell him your nephew has been taken captive. He will right away go out to make war and to try to free his nephew. He'll be killed, and then I will take Sarai, his wife, because he'll be dead. And Sarai, we know, is one of the most beautiful women in the world who ever lived. And Og wanted to take her as a wife. So that's why he came to Avram and told him about Lot. So the Rebbe says these seemingly unrelated facts about Og's name and his motives are written in immediate succession. Talks about his name, the Midrash talks about his name and his intentions. They're immediately, so he says here that these motives are written in immediate succession because evidently seeing Avram's preoccupation with the mitzvah of matzah upon his arrival played a significant role, a critical role, in molding his plans. Matzah is the bread of faith, lechem dehamnusa, the bread of faith. Avram's intense preoccupation with this faith building activity, that Og saw him involved in this so much, reflected his super rational commitment to God, a relationship that focused more on faith than on reason. And Og saw this. Og saw, here's a man who has deep faith. He's a very pious person. Such a person, reasoned Og, is a fanatic and prone to acting irrationally. So therefore he was certain that despite the obvious risks that will happen in wartime, in going out to war, obviously Avraham was not the greatest warrior in the world. He was a shepherd. He wasn't a soldier. And certainly if he were to go out to war, he would be unprepared physically for what was to come to him. Naturally, he would probably be killed, Og figured. Abraham would unreasonably jeopardize his own life to try to save his nephew, likely never to return. That's how Og figured was going to happen. So the matzah that Og found Abraham preparing when he arrived led him to conclude that if he told Abraham that Lot had been taken captive, it would create the perfect opportunity for him to swoop in and take his fanatic's wife as his own. That was how Og thought of the whole thing. Certainly it didn't work out that way, as we know. Abraham made war, he succeeded, he freed his nephew Lot, and as they say, the rest is history. Okay, let's learn another one. Also on the verse, the fugitive came and told Avram the Hebrew, etc. Avram is called Avraham Ivri. First time the Jewish people are not described as Jews until the times of the Megillah of Esther, where Mordechai is called Ish Yehudi, that he was a Jew from Yehuda, but rather Avraham was called an Ivri, a Hebrew, because he came from Ever HaYarden, the other side of the Jordan River, which was Mesopotamia, Haran, which was Iraq. So that's how the Jews were referred to as Hebrews or Ivrim, because they came from that area. So the Rebbe says Og was a cynic, but he could respect humanitarian causes. So it's not surprising that when Avram's nephew Lot was taken as a prisoner of war, Og came to break the news to Avram and encouraged him to save his relative. After all, poor Lot is going to be suffering as a prisoner, and Og felt bad for him, so he told Avram, go and get him. Yet the Midrash tells us that Og's motives were actually immoral. He was really more interested in Sarai. Og's intentions were not for the sake of heaven. Rather, he thought, this Avram is a zealot. I'll tell him, your nephew, etc., etc., as we said before, then I'll take Sarai, his wife. Though the cause was justified and logical, it made sense for Og to go to Avram and tell him about his nephew. Og didn't actually believe that Avram would be victorious over mighty kings who had taken Lot captive. Rather, Og played on Avram's zealous nature, encouraging him to take on a suicidal mission, that there's no way he would succeed in such a tremendous war effort, trusting that Avram would never return and Sarai would be his wife for the taking. This demonstrates the moral danger inherent in following a system of principles based on human understanding alone. If we only follow our human understanding, our own sense of logic, we will get ourselves into big trouble. We need a higher sense, we need a higher purpose. We were learning recently with a bride and groom who are getting married soon. And I told them, you're getting married. There are many books out on marriage. How to be a good husband, how to be a good wife, how to have a happy relationship with each other, all of these things. Go to any bookstore, go on Amazon, you'll see dozens of books on how to have a good marriage. But the next day, they throw away all those books, and someone wrote a new book, telling them, no, those books are wrong. I have a new way to do it. My way is a better way than the old ways. We know that Dr. Spock, Benjamin Spock, wrote a famous book about raising children. Turned out to be a disaster for raising children. It raised a generation of baby boomers who were as selfish as they came, including me. I'm a baby boomer. And today, people don't use Dr. Spock anymore, although I think the book is still available. So how do we know how to raise children? How do we know how to have a successful marriage? Well, the best thing is to go to a place where we believe in successful marriages, namely the Torah. God also has a way to tell us how to have a successful marriage. And don't we think that maybe if we're going to listen to this author or that psychologist or whatever, we should find out what is God's intention? How does God look at having a happy marriage? What does God think about raising successful children, good children? Obviously, that's what we should be doing. So if we just listen to our own principles, our own human understanding about how things should be, we can get ourselves into big, big trouble. A person who, like Og, is guided and motivated only by logic and not by a godly ideal that transcends reason can justify having someone killed in order to take a person's wife, and all the while believe he's doing the right thing and that's reasonable and humanitarian. Og obviously thought that telling Avram that was the right thing to do, the humanitarian thing to do. But in reality, it wasn't. He had his own evil intentions, his own immoral intentions in mind when he did that. Many years ago, a woman came to see me, and she told me that her mother-in-law was dying. And she did not get along with her mother-in-law. Her mother-in-law was a really difficult person to live with. Her mother-in-law, in fact, lived with them, and every day was torture to her, living with this lady. She was very overbearing, critical. Nothing that she did was pleasing in her mother-in-law's sight, and basically she hated her mother-in-law. But since she was her mother-in-law, and she was old, and she was her husband's mother, she felt a responsibility to take care of her. She had no other place to go. And so it went for several years, dealing with this woman, until the woman became very sick, old and sick. She went to the hospital, and her condition got worse. And finally the doctor said to her, you know what? She's on a breathing tube. She's on a respirator. Why don't you just disconnect these things? Let her go peacefully. Let her go on her own. So my friend here was thinking to herself, boy, I can't stand that lady. I wish she was dead. Why don't we just disconnect everything and just let her go already, and I'll have peace in my life. I won't have to suffer anymore. But she felt it wasn't the right thing to do. What is the right thing to do in a situation like that? The doctors are telling her one thing, but it doesn't seem right killing the woman, basically, by disconnecting these things. You're killing her. So she felt she wanted to come and speak to me. She was not a religious person. Not at all. She was Jewish, but not at all religious. She wanted to know, in plain English, what does God want me to do? Whatever we choose, my husband will go along with it, because he was more of a passive person. So she came to the rabbi. The rabbi represents God in her eyes. What does God want me to do? So I said to her, I understand your situation. You can't do it. You cannot disconnect someone from the respirator if they're going to die very, very soon after that. You can't do it. God does not allow you to do it. It's contrary to what God says. She looked at me and she said, okay, that's what we'll do. We'll just keep going the way we're doing. And she left me. I don't think she was so happy with my answer, but that was the way it was. A few weeks later, 3-4 weeks later, I saw her in the shopping center. I said to her, oh, how's your mother-in-law doing? She said, oh, she passed away a few weeks after I saw you. She passed away peacefully in her sleep. And I said to her, how do you feel about that? And she said, I feel that we did the right thing. I felt that we did the right thing by her. So even though our own attitudes, our own understanding of something seems to be one way, doesn't always mean it's the right way. How do we know what is the right way to do something? Should we follow our mind and our own heart? Or should we follow what the Torah tells us to do? Find out what God wants us to do. And that's why rabbis are here, to advise us, to tell us what to do in situations like that. In an Orthodox community, people are very close to the rabbis. Not just in terms of Jewish law, but in terms of other things. Where should I live? What schools do you think I should raise my children in? What job should I take? What about my marriage? Rabbi will very often do marriage counseling. What do you think about these things? And rabbis like to be involved in people's lives. They like to advise people and help people through these difficult times. I know very many of us who were younger, we came out as rabbis, we were very younger. And I know in San Diego we have many very young rabbis. And people say to me, where did he learn all these things? He's only 23 years old. How did he know about these things? He's just a kid. And is giving such incredibly good advice. How does he know these things? And the answer is, he learned them in yeshiva. He learned them growing up. He spent years studying the Rebbe's books and the Rebbe's thoughts, and the sages of Israel, the Talmud, Hasidic philosophy, and that's how he learned it. So the answers to mankind's questions are clearly found in the Torah. And what they're telling us is that is our destination. That is where we should be going. That is the direction in which we should be living. So Abraham was told to go on. He was not told to where to go, because he knew that God will end up telling him where to go, where is the right place. And as long as you're with God, you can't go wrong. Everyone have a good week.